May 29th, 1940, night. The English Channel off the coast of Dunkirk. The old fishing seiner, the sea serpent, was a floating island of madness in the icy black water. It was tossed mercilessly on the short, angry waves, and every slam into the water echoed with a dull groan through its exhausted wooden hull. The air was thick and heavy, saturated with the acrid smell of smoke, fuel oil, and something else. Something indescribably awful that the brain desperately refused to identify. On the horizon, the distant coast of France burned like a gigantic funeral pyre, its crimson glow staining the low clouds the color of dried blood. In the light of these distant fires, the water looked like black mercury. On board the sea serpent were 57 men, 57 souls in battered, soaking bodies. The seiner was designed for a maximum of 20. It was submerged to its waterline, and it seemed that one more careless breath, one more tear, and it would founder, sinking and dragging its precious and simultaneously cursed cargo down with it. At the center of this hell, at the helm, stood Arthur Blackwood, 56 years of age. His face, weathered by decades of salt winds and merciless sun, now resembled a stone mask. His eyes, which could spot the signs of a storm from miles away, now stared unseeingly into the dancing darkness ahead. The knuckles of his fingers clamped around the wheel had turned white. Beside him, crouching, his 17-year-old son Thomas was bailing a murky sludge from the cockpit floor with a bucket, a mixture of seawater, blood, and grime. His movements were mechanical, and in his wide-open eyes was a frozen, primal terror. The soldiers sat, lay, and stood shoulder to shoulder, occupying every inch of space. They were silent. This silence was more terrifying than any scream. It was the silence of broken men who had stared into the abyss and seen its reflection in their own souls. They looked at Arthur, but there was no gratitude in their gazes. There was fear, a raw, primal fear. Because on the deck, propped against the mast, stood Arthur's old hunting rifle, a double-barreled shotgun he used for shooting ducks over the Kent marshes. An hour ago, he had pointed that gun at them, at his own people, at the men he had come to save. But to understand how a rescue mission had turned into an armed standoff, how a simple fisherman had come to threaten unarmed British soldiers with a weapon, we must go back 72 hours to the quiet English port of Ramsgate, when the world still seemed comprehensible and was divided into friend and foe. May 26, 1940, Ramsgate, County Kent. The morning was deceptively calm. The air, clean and cool, smelled of salt, iodine, and freshly brewed coffee from the small coastal cafes. The cries of gulls mingled with the distant hammering from the shipyard, and the creak of rigging on the fishing boats moored at the quay. The war, which the radio called the phony war, seemed a distant, abstract thing, happening on the other side of the gray strip of the English Channel. For Arthur Blackwood, owner of the sturdy, tarred seiner sea serpent, this day began like 1,000 others. He sat on an overturned crate on the pier, methodically mending a net. His hands, like the roots of an old oak, moved slowly but surely, each knot the result of decades of experience. Arthur was a quiet man, one with the sea. He knew its moods, its fury, and its generosity. The sea was his provider, his confidant, and his eternal adversary. Next to him, trying to imitate his father but with youthful impatience, sat Thomas. At 17, he was thin and lanky, with a boyish flush still on his cheeks and eyes that burned with an idealism gleaned from books about sea adventures and heroic battles. He worshipped his father and dreamed of one day becoming just like him, strong, calm, and indestructible, like the coastal cliffs. Their conversations were rare and brief. They understood each other without words, by the movement of an eyebrow, the tilt of a head. The sea serpent, their home and their fortress, bobbed nearby, Arthur's pride and Thomas's delight. Arthur had built it with his own father almost 40 years ago. Every plank knew his hands. Every frame was soaked with his sweat. That day, everything changed. A young naval officer with a folder under his arm strode down the pier, his steps precise. He stopped before them. His pristine white uniform seemed an alien smudge against the backdrop of tarred planks and fishing nets. "Arthur Blackwood?" he asked, his voice as sharp as a gull's cry. Arthur slowly raised his head. The officer spoke of the Royal Navy, of duty, of the Empire. He spoke of the Admiralty's appeal to all whose vessels were capable of crossing the Channel. He spoke of British boys trapped on the French coast in a place called Dunkirk. They needed help. They needed evacuation. They needed small ships. "Your seiner will do," the officer concluded. "Fuel and provisions will be supplied. You sail tomorrow at dawn. Britain is counting on you." He spoke as if it were an ordinary fishing trip. Thomas's eyes lit up. Dunkirk, evacuation, rescue. It was like a page from his favorite books. A real adventure, a chance to be a hero. He looked at his father, expecting him to agree immediately, to straighten his back with pride. But Arthur was silent. He looked out at the grey water of the Channel, and in his eyes, there was neither excitement nor patriotic fervor. There was a deep, old anxiety. He knew this strait. He knew its treacherous currents, its sudden storms, and its fogs as thick as milk. And he also knew that war was no storybook adventure. He did not say this aloud. He simply nodded. Thomas jumped up, ready to run and prepare the Serpent for the journey. "I'm with you, father," he exclaimed. Arthur slowly turned his head and looked at his son. In his gaze, pride and a profound sadness mingled. "No," he said quietly, but firmly. "You're staying here." The rest of the day was spent in argument. Thomas shouted, pleaded, argued that he was already 17, that he was not a child, that he could help. Arthur was adamant. That night, as the old house fell silent, Thomas lay in his bed, listening to the wind whistle in the chimney. He could not accept it. This was his war too, his chance, and he would not miss it. An hour before dawn, when Arthur, already dressed, came down to the kitchen, he saw Thomas sitting at the table. He too was dressed in his best storm gear, a packed duffel bag beside him. "I'm going with you," he said calmly, his voice no longer holding any youthful hysteria, but a cold determination he had inherited from his father. "You can't manage alone. You need a hand. And you know no one knows the Serpent better than I do." Arthur looked at him for a long time, and then, for the first time in many years, the semblance of a smile touched his stern lips. He simply nodded. They left the house, in the pre-dawn gloom. They walked the familiar streets to the port, to their ship, to their destiny. They thought they were going to save others. They did not yet know that the waves of the Channel were carrying them not to glory, but into the very heart of a storm where it is not ships that break, but human souls. The crossing of the English Channel began with a deceptive peace. The sky was a pearly gray like the inside of a seashell, and the sea was calm, with only a gentle swell lazily rocking the sea serpent. The engine ran smoothly and familiarly, its chugging the most reassuring music in the world to Arthur and Thomas. They sailed as part of an entire flotilla of vessels just like theirs. Fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, tugboats, barges. This motley fleet, which would later be called the Little Ships of Dunkirk, at first filled Thomas with a sense of excitement and unity. It seemed as if all of Britain had risen up to save her sons. He stood at the bow, breathing in the salt wind, his heart beating in time with the engine. But the closer they got to the French coast, the more the atmosphere changed. The first thing to change was the air. It became heavy, saturated with a smell of burning that tickled the throat and induced nausea. Then the sound changed. The steady drone of engines was replaced by a distant, barely audible rumble, like the sound of a faraway thunderstorm. But it was not a thunderstorm. Arthur, standing at the helm, grew grim. He knew that sound. The sound of war. Finally, the horizon itself changed. A huge column of black smoke rose above it, as if a giant volcano were erupting from beneath the sea. It was the Dunkirk oil refineries, burning. About 2 hours later, they saw the town itself, or what was left of it. It was a landscape from hell, painted by a mad artist. The town was shrouded in smoke, from which the skeletons of buildings protruded like broken teeth. Above it, planes circled like a swarm of vicious insects. Each of their dives was followed by a dull thud that made the water tremble even several miles from the shore. But that was not the most terrifying thing. The most terrifying thing was the beach. An endless strip of sand from the town itself to the village of Dupin was black with people. This was not an army. It was a gigantic, multi-thousand-strong crowd. Tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of men stood in complete silence, formed into endless queues that stretched right into the sea. They stood waist-deep, chest-deep in the cold water, awaiting rescue. Some tried to build makeshift piers from abandoned trucks and crates, but the sea mercilessly destroyed their efforts. Thomas froze, clutching the railing. His ideas of a heroic evacuation were shattered against this picture of total, silent despair. This was not like the war in the books. There were no banners or charging soldiers here. There were only endless queues of exhausted, broken men patiently waiting for their fate under an indifferent sky. Suddenly, a soul-chilling wail tore through the air. "Get down!" Arthur yelled. Thomas did not immediately understand what had happened. Something black had detached itself from the sky and was plummeting downward at incredible speed. The siren, which would later be called the Jericho trumpet, paralyzed the will. It was a Stuka, a German dive bomber. The plane slammed into the crowd of men on the beach. The explosion was muffled but terrible. Sand, water, and human bodies flew into the air. The queue wavered, broke apart, and people scattered. But there was nowhere to run. A moment later, they were forming a queue again, as if nothing had happened. Only a black crater in the sand and a few motionless bodies being slowly carried away by the waves served as a reminder of the tragedy. Thomas threw up right over the side. He was shaking. It was impossible to comprehend, impossible to accept. Arthur came over and put his heavy hand on his shoulder. "Look at me," he said firmly. "Look only at me. Don't look at the shore. We came here to work. Focus on the work." Arthur steered the sea serpent toward the eastern mole, a long stone breakwater extending into the sea. There were destroyers there, but they couldn't get close to the shore because of the shallows. Their task was simple, to pick up men from the shallows and ferry them to the larger ships. Shuttle work. But as they drew closer, Arthur understood the full difficulty of the task. The water around the mole was boiling with people. Soldiers were jumping from the high mole into the water, trying to swim to the rescue vessels. Many drowned immediately, pulled down by their heavy equipment. Others thrashed desperately, clinging to each other. It was a scene from Dante's Inferno. And at that moment, Arthur Blackwood, a simple fisherman, understood. If they wanted to survive and save anyone, they would have to forget everything they knew about order and humanity. They would have to become not rescuers, but jailers on their own ship. The first trip was their baptism by fire, a test of strength that would change them both forever. Arthur, possessing an instinctive feel for the sea, did not go into the heart of the inferno where dozens of boats and launches had already created a chaotic scrum around the destroyers. He spotted a group of soldiers standing chest-deep in the water, away from the main mass, near a half-destroyed breakwater. They were holding a stretcher with a wounded man above the water. They weren't shouting, not waving their arms. They just stood and waited, and in their silent vigil there was more dignity than in all the panic at the mole. "To them," Arthur said curtly, and Thomas, standing ready with a boat hook, nodded. Maneuvering with a surgeon's precision, Arthur brought the sea serpent as close as he could. The soldiers, seeing them, began to move slowly toward the boat. The water churned around their tired bodies. "Wounded only!" Arthur shouted, his voice lost in the roar of a distant explosion. But they had heard him. First, they passed a young lad on a stretcher aboard. His leg was wrapped in bloody rags and his face was as white as chalk. Then another, with a bandaged head. Thomas and Arthur hauled them onto the deck, trying not to cause any more pain. Their hands slipped on the wet uniforms. They could feel the trembling of weakened bodies beneath their fingers. The third was an officer who had helped load the others. When his comrades were safe, he tried to pull himself aboard, but his strength failed him. He just hung by his arms, his head slumping onto his chest. Arthur and Thomas hauled him onto the deck together. In total, they took 20 men. All of them were exhausted, many were wounded, but in their eyes shone boundless gratitude. They tried to say something, to shake their hands, but they lacked the strength. They just lay on the deck, curled up, shivering from the cold and the horror they had endured. For Thomas, these were moments of triumph. This was it. This was why they had come. He felt like a true hero. He ran between the soldiers, handing out canteens of water and old blankets his mother had packed. The soldiers looked at him, a 17-year-old boy, as if he were a guardian angel. One of them, just a kid himself, no older than Thomas, squeezed his hand and whispered, "Thank you." And in that one word was all the pain and all the hope of this war. Arthur, however, did not share his son's euphoria. He stood at the helm, his face remaining grim. He saw what Thomas did not notice. He saw how other boats, trying to approach the mole, were being swarmed by the crowd. Soldiers, maddened with fear, clung to the sides, climbed over one another, threatening to capsize the small vessels. He saw one dinghy, overloaded to its limit, take on water over its side and slowly sink, turning into a boiling cauldron of thrashing bodies. Arthur turned away. He steered the Sea Serpent toward the destroyer HMS Ivanhoe, which was anchored offshore. The path to it was a slalom between floating wreckage, empty life jackets, and most horrifyingly, bodies. Thomas tried not to look down, but every time a face with open, unseeing eyes floated past, he flinched. Disembarking onto the destroyer was no easier. Storm ladders and rope nets were thrown down from the warship's side. Transferring the wounded became a complex operation. The sailors from the destroyer and Arthur and Thomas, rocking on the waves carefully, inch by inch, lifted the men onto the high deck. When the last soldier was aboard the destroyer, the ship's captain shouted to them through a megaphone, "Excellent work, Sea Serpent. Go back for the next lot." Thomas proudly straightened his back, but when they turned back toward the shore, the picture they saw made his heart clench with a bad premonition. The situation on the beach had changed. If an hour ago there had been despair, now panic reigned. Another Stuka raid had been the last straw. Order had collapsed. Now thousands of men were rushing into the water, heedless of the path, trying to swim to the ships. This was no longer a retreat. It was a mass, suicidal stampede. Arthur gripped the wheel. He knew the second trip would be nothing like the first. The easy work was over. Hell was just beginning. The Sea Serpent was not just a piece of wood and metal. To Arthur, it was a living creature, an extension of his own hands and his will. He knew its every creak, its every quirk. And now, this knowledge, this fisherman's experience accumulated over decades, had become their main and only weapon in this chaos. Arthur saw that most rescuers were trying to work by the mole, where the concentration of soldiers was highest. But that was precisely where the panic was most intense, turning the rescue operation into a deadly crush. He, however, after studying the coastline with a glance, steered his seiner to a different spot, where a small, relatively calm basin had formed between two sunken trucks. The depth there was minimal, and no naval cutter would risk going in. But Arthur knew the draft of his Serpent to the inch. He could almost physically feel the bottom through the vibration of the hull. "Thomas, to the bow with the boat hook," he commanded. "Push off from the truck." Thomas, having recovered from the initial shock, worked like a well-oiled machine. He stood on the bow of the rocking vessel, bracing a long boat hook against the rusty side of the submerged vehicle, preventing the Serpent from running aground. This was their first tactical victory. They had found their own narrow and dangerous but relatively safe path to the shore. They had created their own microscopic beachhead in an ocean of chaos. There were people in this basin too, but they were cut off from the main crowd, and the panic here had not yet reached its peak. Seeing them, a few dozen soldiers moved toward them. Arthur cut the engine, and in the ensuing silence his voice rang out, firm and authoritative. "Listen up. I'm taking the wounded only. 20 men, no more. Not a single able-bodied man. Board one at a time. No panic. Anyone who tries to cut in line stays here. Is that understood?" These were harsh, almost cruel words, but they held the logic of survival. The soldiers, exhausted by days of waiting and bombing, instinctively sensed in this stern old man the strength and order they so desperately lacked. Among them was a sergeant, a tall man with a bandaged arm, who took command. "You heard him," he bellowed. "Private Smith, Jones, you help with the stretcher cases. The rest of you, form a line. Move it!" And a miracle occurred. The chaotic mob transformed into an organized group. They themselves selected the most severely wounded, helped them to the boat, and passed them into the hands of Arthur and Thomas. This was their second victory. The victory of order over chaos. They felt like masters of the situation. They were not just rescuing, they were organizing the rescue. They made 3 such trips that day, 60 lives saved. Each time they returned to their secret basin, and each time an organized group of wounded awaited them under the command of that same sergeant. They worked as a single organism. Arthur was responsible for maneuvering, Thomas for receiving the men aboard, and the sergeant for order on the shore. Their small seiner had become a Noah's Ark, and Arthur's knowledge of the sea and the shallows, a divine providence showing the way to salvation. With each successful trip, Thomas's confidence grew. Fear gave way to excitement and pride. They were doing what others could not. They had conquered the panic. They had established order. They were heroes. By evening, as they delivered their last batch to a transport ship, they felt a colossal fatigue but also a deep satisfaction. It seemed they had found the key to this impossible task. It seemed they could work like this tomorrow and the day after until the last man was evacuated. But war does not like order, and it was preparing its own, most terrible surprise for them. As they were about to pull away from the transport to moor alongside it for the night, a new, horrifying roar came from the shore. It was not bombs. The artillery shelling had begun. German batteries brought up to Dunkirk had opened fire directly on the beaches, on the defenseless quays. This changed everything. If the bombs had been a deadly lottery, the artillery barrage was a methodical, cold-blooded annihilation. The panic they had seen during the day now seemed like a mild disturbance compared to the hell that had just been unleashed on the shore. Arthur looked at the distant beach, where shells were exploding, and his face became stone once more. He realized that their small, orderly system, their secret basin, their alliance with the sergeant, all of it had been destroyed. Tomorrow they would be met not by a crowd, but by a maddened, 1,000-headed beast ready to do anything for salvation. And their little ark would be in its path. They spent the night moored to the side of a large coal transport, but it couldn't be called sleep. It was a fitful, shallow oblivion, interrupted by the rumbling from the shore and the cries of the wounded being lifted aboard the transport. Thomas had nightmares. He was drowning in a sea of faces contorted by fear, and every face whispered his name. He woke from the cold and from his own scream. Arthur was already awake. He was sitting on the deck, smoking his pipe and looking at the burning Dunkirk. The glow from the fires was so bright you could read a book by it. "Did you think we changed anything?" he asked quietly, without turning around. Thomas didn't answer. He understood it all himself. Their success yesterday had been just a drop in an ocean of suffering. They had created their small island of order, but the ocean of chaos was already eroding its foundation. In the morning they headed for the shore again. The scene that greeted them was even worse than they had imagined. The nighttime artillery barrage had broken the last remnants of discipline. Now there were no queues on the beach, no organized groups. There was only one enormous, teeming mass of people that surged in waves toward the surf. Soldiers were throwing away their weapons, helmets, packs, anything that hindered their flight. They were trying to build rafts from whatever they could find, paddling desperately with their hands just to get away from this cursed shore. Their secret basin was also packed with men. There was no question of any order. When the sea serpent appeared in the gap between the trucks, hundreds of eyes turned to it. And in these eyes, there was no longer hope. There was a predatory, primal will to survive. At any cost. "Father, maybe we shouldn't?" Thomas whispered, his heart seized with fear. But Arthur remained silent. He slowly guided the seiner forward, He could not turn back. Duty was stronger than fear. As soon as they were close enough, the crowd rushed them. It was nothing like yesterday's loading. It was an assault. Dozens of men tried to clamber aboard at once, grabbing onto anything they could reach. They pushed each other aside, pulling those ahead of them back into the water. "Back!" Arthur yelled. "One at a time! You'll capsize us!" But no one listened. His voice was drowned out by the roar of the crowd, a mix of pleas, curses, and cries of pain. The seiner listed dangerously. Water poured over the side. Thomas, grabbing an oar, desperately tried to push back those climbing the hull. He hit their hands, their fingers, but they seemed to feel no pain. Their eyes were crazed. They looked right through him. At that moment, for the first time, Thomas was truly afraid not for his own life, but for his father's. He saw a soldier, already aboard, try to shove Arthur away from the helm. "Let me have it, old man! I'll steer myself!" he rasped. Arthur, without a word, punched him hard in the face. The soldier collapsed onto the deck. This was the beginning of their transformation. They were no longer rescuers. They were defending themselves from the very men they had come to save. With incredible difficulty, they managed to take on 25 men, 5 more than was safe, and pull away from the shore. The trip to the transport was made in oppressive silence. The rescued soldiers sat with their heads down, avoiding eye contact with each other and with their saviors. They were not grateful. They were ashamed. And Arthur and Thomas were ashamed too. They felt like traitors. It felt as if they had stabbed their own men in the back. Aboard the transport, while the men were disembarking, Arthur made a decision. "That's it, Thomas," he said. "We're going back to Ramsgate. We've done all we can." But Thomas shook his head. "No, father," he replied, and there was a new, hard edge to his voice. "We can't. There are still people there. We have to try again." Arthur looked at his son for a long time. He saw how, in these 2 days, the boy who dreamed of heroic deeds had vanished. In his place was a young man who had looked into hell and had not broken. And Arthur, though he understood the danger, could not refuse him. He nodded. But before casting off, he went down into the cabin. When he returned, he was holding his old hunting rifle and a cartridge belt. Thomas stared at him, bewildered. "What for?" he asked. "Just in case," Arthur answered hollowly. They did not yet know that this "just in case" was already waiting for them at the shore, ready to deal them a final, crushing blow that would forever divide their lives into before and after. Their third trip to the shore was the culmination of all the horror, the concentrated embodiment of the hell of Dunkirk. When they entered their makeshift harbor between the sunken trucks for the third time, a crowd was waiting for them. But now it was not just a crowd, but an enraged, maddened mass of several hundred men. It seemed that everyone left on this stretch of beach had converged here, at this single point of hope. They stood in the water like a pack of hungry wolves that had spotted its prey. Arthur stopped the seiner 50 feet away from them. "Father, they'll sink us!" Thomas shouted, his voice breaking. Arthur was silent. He looked at those hundreds of eyes in which nothing human remained, only the animal instinct for self-preservation. "Stay where you are," he yelled, his voice cracking with strain. "I'll approach when you calm down. I'm only taking the wounded." In response, a multi-voiced roar erupted, containing no words, only rage and desperation, and the crowd charged them. They surged through the water, heedless of their path, kicking up clouds of spray, falling and getting up again. The front ranks were already reaching the seiner. Arthur knew they had only seconds. If that mass reached them, they were doomed. They would simply be crushed, sunk, without a second thought. "Thomas, take the helm," he commanded. "Be ready to go full astern." He grabbed the rifle. Thomas froze. "Father, no," he whispered. But Arthur no longer heard him. He broke open the double-barreled shotgun, checked the shells. His movements were slow and precise, like a man performing a solemn ritual. The first soldiers had reached the side. Dozens of hands clawed at the wood, trying to pull themselves up. The seiner listed so sharply that Thomas thought they were about to capsize. A cry of despair escaped his throat. And at that moment, Arthur raised the rifle. He didn't aim at the men. He pointed the barrels at the sky. A shot boomed. A loud, sharp, deafening sound that for a moment drowned out all the other sounds of war. The crowd froze. An unnatural, ringing silence fell. Everyone stared at the old man with the smoking rifle in his hands. His face was terrifying in its resolve. "One more step," he rasped, his voice carrying over the water, "and the next blast won't be in the air. I'm not joking. Back! All of you! Back!" It was a lie. He would never have fired on his own countrymen. But they didn't know that. They saw only the icy eyes and the two black maws of the barrels aimed in their direction. And they believed him. The animal fear of death proved stronger than the panic. The crowd wavered and slowly, reluctantly, began to retreat. One by one they let go of the side, moving back into the water. The seiner righted itself as if breathing a sigh of relief. "5 men," Arthur shouted. "The 5 most badly wounded. Bring them here. The rest of you, stay put." A few soldiers, coming to their senses, lifted their comrades from the water and carried them toward the boat. Arthur did not lower the rifle. He stood like a sentry while Thomas, with trembling hands, received the wounded aboard. These were the longest minutes of their lives. When the 5th soldier was on deck, Arthur commanded, "Full astern." The engine roared to life, and the sea serpent began to move slowly away from the shore, leaving the silent crowd behind. Arthur lowered the rifle. His hands were shaking. He looked at his palms as if seeing them for the first time. He had just threatened to kill the men he had sworn to save. He had crossed a line. Something inside him had broken, crumbled to dust. He looked at Thomas. His son was standing by the side, his back turned, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He was not crying from fear. He was crying from shame for his father and for the entire human race. In that moment, an invisible crack formed between them, one that would never heal. They had won. They had survived. But the price of that victory was terrible. They had lost something far more important than their lives. They had lost their faith in people. The journey back to the destroyer passed in an absolute oppressive silence, broken only by the groans of the 5 wounded men and the steady chug of the engine. Arthur stood at the helm, but he wasn't steering the boat. His hands did it mechanically out of habit. His gaze was fixed on the void. Over and over he replayed the scene on the beach in his mind. The sound of the shot, the frozen crowd, the crazed eyes of the soldiers, Thomas's face, contorted with horror. Each time, the image brought a wave of nausea. He, Arthur Blackwood, a man who had lived his whole life by the simple, clear laws of the sea and of honor, had become the thing he despised most in the world. A man who threatens the unarmed with a gun. He had saved his ship, saved his son, saved these 5 wretched men. But he felt not like a savior, but an executioner. Thomas sat in the stern, his back to his father. He couldn't look at him. The man who had been his embodiment of strength and justice, his hero, his rock, had turned into a cruel jailer before his very eyes. Thomas understood with his mind that there had been no other way, that his father had saved them all, but his heart refused to accept it. The world that had seemed so simple and clear with its good guys and bad guys had collapsed in an instant. It turned out that your own side could be more terrifying than the enemy. It turned out that to survive, you had to become a beast yourself. This knowledge was an unbearable burden for a 17-year-old boy. When they reached the destroyer, they were greeted as heroes. The sailors who had watched the events unfold from the deck of the large ship had only seen the outward sequence of events. The small seiner surrounded by a mob, the shot that restored order, and the rescue of the wounded. They did not see what was happening in the souls of Arthur and Thomas. "Damn brave, old man," a lieutenant yelled to them from the bridge. "You showed them what's what." Arthur didn't reply. He silently helped transfer the last wounded man, and then without raising his head said, "We're leaving. We're almost out of fuel." The lieutenant nodded. "Understood. You've done more than your share. Go home with honor. Britain will not forget you. Honor. Britain. The words now sounded like a mockery. Arthur turned the sea serpent around and headed northwest toward the white cliffs of Dover. They were leaving hell, but hell was not leaving them. It had taken up permanent residence in their hearts. They did not exchange a single word for the entire journey back. The silence between father and son was thick and heavy, like a pre-dawn fog. They worked in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. They were closer than ever in this small boat in the middle of the sea, and at the same time, infinitely far apart. When the familiar outlines of Ramsgate appeared on the horizon, neither of them felt any relief. They were returning to a world to which they no longer belonged. When they entered the harbor, a crowd was waiting. The whole town had poured out onto the pier. People were shouting, waving flags. Women were crying with joy. They were being welcomed as heroes returning with a victory. The town's mayor in his ceremonial chain was shaking their hands. Journalists were snapping photographs. Arthur and Thomas stood on the deck of their battered seiner, deafened by the celebration, and felt like impostors. None of these people knew or could even imagine what they had truly endured. No one knew that their main enemy had not been the Germans, but their own countrymen. No one knew about the gunshot that still echoed in their ears. Their personal tragedy, their shame, and their pain were drowned in the universal myth of the miracle of Dunkirk, of the heroic unity of a nation. They stood in the rays of glory, but felt only an icy loneliness. Their rescue had become a new, even more sophisticated prison, a prison of silence and misunderstanding. Their feet, their true feet, was buried at the bottom of the English Channel, along with their illusions. The war continued, but for Arthur and Thomas Blackwood, it had ended the day they returned from Dunkirk. They came home physically unharmed, but their souls were maimed. The wall of silence that had risen between them on the journey back remained standing, insurmountable and cold. They lived in the same house, ate at the same table, worked on the same boat, but they hardly spoke. Every glance, every accidental touch, reminded them of what had happened. Arthur tried to speak, to explain, but the words would get stuck in his throat. How could he explain something he himself could not fully comprehend? How could he convey the chilling horror and cold resolve that had made him raise his rifle? He became even more silent and withdrawn than before. He would sit on the pier for hours, staring at the sea, but in his mind, he was there, on the bloody beaches of Dunkirk. People said he had aged 10 years in those 3 days. His hair had turned completely gray, and a deep sorrow was permanently fixed in his eyes. Thomas changed even more. His youthful idealism was replaced by a hard, brittle cynicism. He no longer read books about heroic battles. He had seen war without its embellishments, and the sight had poisoned his soul. He did not blame his father, but he could not forgive him. Not for the gunshot, but for destroying his world, for showing him what a human being is capable of in desperation. 2 months later, on the day he turned 18, Thomas packed his things. He had volunteered for the Royal Navy. He wanted a real war, where there was a clear line between friend and foe, where the enemy was in front of you, not beside you. He wanted to escape the ghosts of Dunkirk. The farewell was brief. They stood on the doorstep of their home. "Take care of yourself, son," Arthur said. "You too, father," Thomas replied. They did not embrace. Thomas walked away without looking back. Arthur watched him for a long time until his figure dissolved into the morning fog. Thomas Blackwood served on a destroyer in the Atlantic escorting convoys. He was a good sailor, brave and diligent. He was wounded several times. In 1943, his ship was torpedoed by a German U-boat and sank within 10 minutes. Thomas's body was never found. Arthur Blackwood received the official notification, the telegram. He read it with a stone face, folded it neatly and put it away in a desk drawer. He did not shed a single tear. It seemed all his tears had dried up there, off the coast of France. He continued to go to sea on his sea serpent almost until the day he died. He became a local legend, the silent old man, one of the heroes of Dunkirk. But no one ever heard him tell a single story about those days. He took his secret to the grave. He died in 1965 of a heart attack, sitting in his armchair with a view of the English Channel. In his hands was an old, battered photograph of a smiling 17-year-old boy standing on the deck of a fishing seiner. History, the official history told in newspapers and books, transformed the evacuation from Dunkirk into a national myth, a miracle of deliverance, a triumph of the British spirit, when the entire nation, from admirals to simple fishermen, united to save its army. It was a beautiful, inspiring story, one that Britain desperately needed in those dark days. And in that story there was no room for filth, fear, and betrayal. There was no room for the panic that turns men into beasts, and there was certainly no room for an old fisherman who was forced to aim his rifle at his own soldiers. The story of Arthur and Thomas Blackwood, like hundreds of other similar stories, was erased, forgotten, buried under a thick layer of patriotic propaganda. Their names appeared on the official lists of participants in Operation Dynamo. The sea serpent was counted among the celebrated little ships, but the true price of their heroism, their personal tragedy, remained unknown. But history has a way of sprouting even through the asphalt of official chronicles. The story of Arthur and Thomas did not vanish without a trace. It became a legend, a quiet fisherman's tale that old sailors in the pubs of Ramsgate would whisper to the young ones over a pint of ale. They said there was this old man, Blackwood, a true sea dog. They said that alone on his boat, he had brought back over 100 men from the very hell of Dunkirk. And they also said that on his last trip, he had faced a mutiny on board, and to pacify the soldiers, who were mad with fear, he had to fire his hunting rifle. In this legend, there was no longer any condemnation. There was only admiration and a bitter understanding. There was a belief among the fishermen that old Blackwood's ghost still watched over these waters, and that in a heavy storm, when the waves of the channel turned particularly vicious, you can see the silhouette of his sea serpent coming to the aid of those in distress. This story is not just a chronicle of a forgotten deed. It is a reminder that war is never beautiful, that in war, there are no simple solutions and no unambiguous heroes. It is a tale of how the most terrible battles are fought not on the battlefield, but in the human soul, and that sometimes, to save human lives, one must sacrifice one's own humanity. Arthur Blackwood and his son Thomas did not seek glory. They just wanted to help. But fate presented them with a choice that no human being should ever have to face. They made their choice, and they paid the price in full. Their heroism is not in how many they saved. It is in the fact that, having looked into the very abyss of human despair, they did not break completely and managed to return, albeit with souls that were forever scarred. And as long as their legend lives, they will not be forgotten.